Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to this afternoon sessions of the HKGFA 5th Annual Forum on Integrating Sustainable Finance in GBA and Beyond. And this is a special year for us because it's also the GBA-GFA third year anniversary, and we are where Shenzhen is passing the GBA-GFA presidency to Hong Kong for the next year. My name is Tracy Wong Harris, Vice President, Deputy Secretary General at HKGFA. I'm also the Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Finance Asia at Untitled Chapter. It's my absolute pleasure to be your MC for an action-packed afternoon, starting with Fireside chat on advancing Hong Kong as a regional sustainable center, which will start shortly, followed by 3 panels deep dive into carbon market, ESG, and transition financing. So some housekeeping. So this afternoon will be conducted in English. So if you want to listen to that in Mandarin, please hold one of the headsets. And also on your name tag, there's a QR code. So you can use the QR code to pose questions for all your panels, this afternoon's panel. Last but not least, there's refreshment outside of the room if you, for you to enjoy. So without further ado, let me invite our Fireside chat speakers to the stage. Mr. Nicolas Aguzin, CEO of Hong Kong Exchange Clearing Limited. Mr. Alder, CEO of Securities and Futures Commission, Chairman of IOSCO Board. Also, Mr. Joseph Chan, Under-Secretary of Financial Services and Treasury, the Hong Kong government's SAR. Please, thank you. Good afternoon, Gucho, Ashley, and Joseph. Thank you for joining us today. It's my absolute pleasure to have all 3 of you physically on stage, and I'm sure the audience would agree with me that you need no introduction. So let's go straight to it. So Hong Kong has gone a long way in establishing itself as green and sustainable finance center, with green and sustainable debt market hitting over $57 billion last year. So in your view, what are the significant contributors to the success of sustainable finance in Hong Kong today? Maybe that I start with Joseph from the government's perspective.
Sure, Tracy, thank you. Thanks HKGFA for organizing this event, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here today. Well, first of all, I think very naturally, Hong Kong is already Asia's leading international financial center, and we lead on various leagues table in the region. For example, in capital markets, we rank #1 in terms of issuing and arranging Asian international bonds. In terms of risk management, we rank #1 in terms of insurance density in the region. In terms of asset and wealth management business, our AUM reached $4.5 trillion last year, and we observed a growth of 48% over the 3-year period. And we also rank #1 in Asia in terms of AUM as a cross-border wealth center. So all these shows that we are in a leading position in different sectors in the industry. So very naturally, we are also well positioned to be the region's green and sustainable finance hub in terms of raising green capital and offering green financial products as well. Apart from our natural strength as Asia's leading international finance center, of course, we are also the country's, China's, international financial center. So as we all know, our presidency made it clear in a speech to UN back in 2020 that our country would endeavor to have carbon dioxide emissions peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. So we, as the country's financial center, can help channel green capital to support the country's decarbonization process, and it's a huge role for us to play there. And in fact, this direction and approach is also fully supported by the Central People's Government. So the outline development plan for the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, and also the opinion on providing financial support for the development of the Greater Bay Area promulgated by the Central People's Government back in 2019 and 2020 respectively, support Hong Kong's development into the Green Finance Center for the Greater Bay Area. And apart from the Asia and the mainland perspective, of course, locally, we also need to provide a conducive environment for green and sustainable finance to develop here. And the HKSR government has been implementing different measures and initiatives to achieve that. So for example, under the government Green Bond Program, since inception, we have raised close to $10 billion equivalent of government green bonds in order to raise Hong Kong's profile and also provide benchmark pricing for the market. Our issuances were very well received by the global investors, and the retail tranche that we issued in May this year was actually the largest retail green bond issuance across the globe at the time. And also we launched the Green and Sustainable Finance Grant Scheme last year to provide subsidy for eligible green bond issuers or loan borrowers to cover the expenses or external review services. And the scheme so far has been very well received, and at the end of last month, around 130 applications have already been approved, involving a grant amount of about 130 million Hong Kong dollars. So you can see that from our positioning, be that the Asia's hub, gateway to the mainland market, and a local policy, I think all this contributes to our success as a green and sustainable finance hub.
Thank you, Joseph. Can I come to you, Ashley?
Yeah, sure. If you, look at that aspect of sustainable finance, which is focused on climate, it's obvious and it's very trite to say that it is essentially a global problem. And the reason I mention that in the context of Hong Kong is that in my experience, and now I have a fair amount of it, participating in different international bodies which focus on climate finance and potential regulation around that, is that by and large, there tends to be quite a large or very large focus on what's happening in Europe so far as regulation is concerned, which is pretty significant. There is a growing focus on what is happening in the US, particularly when it comes to potential changes to the rules around corporate disclosure of emissions footprints and climate risks and opportunities, very sort of TCFD based, but as amended. But there has been relatively little realization that unless climate finance is mobilized in the right direction in this part of the world, those other efforts will only have extremely limited impact. And the point that I usually make, and I think people are probably getting sick of hearing it in the international fora, is that just so far as emissions is concerned, of course, Asia accounts for around half of the global total, and China accounts for around 30%. And different countries, including China, have set net zero ambitions. And when that, so ultimately the question is, okay, on a global scale, how do you look to Asia, and what can Asia do, and in particular, what can Hong Kong do to contribute to the ability of institutions to identify climate risks, opportunities, to identify emission footprints, and then decide how they're going to configure their capital flows accordingly. And the point about Hong Kong is relatively straightforward. And it's, from my perspective in the SFC, and we are a securities markets regulator, we have a very close relationship with the exchange, of course, as in that capacity. One of the most significant factors is simply the fact that the stock exchange in Hong Kong is now largely made up, both in terms of number and market capitalization, of companies whose businesses in large part sit in mainland China, and many of them are very significant businesses there. So the challenge for us in Hong Kong, in a sense, is to adapt what a traditional role has been over many years, which is an intermediary for capital flows as between the world and mainland China, either direct capital flows through mechanisms such as Stock Connect, etc., through market access schemes, or capital flows directly into the listed market in Hong Kong, which is ultimately, to an extent, a proxy for mainland China. That sets up a series of challenges. because as we implement regulation in Hong Kong, which we hope to do, around things like corporate level disclosure, around climate risk opportunities, emission footprints, etc., then they would need to correlate with domestic expectations in mainland China. And that poses a huge opportunity. I personally think it's essential to solve it, because if we don't, then we won't be able to support adequately the overall aim for net zero, or to achieve net zero ambitions. But it also sets up quite a few challenges around consistency and around the dialogue to make sure that there is sufficient alignment of expectations for those businesses. Now, there's a lot more around what Hong Kong can do, but I think from my perspective, it's a kind of key actor in solving a problem which is global and which everyone has seen is becoming more and more urgent.
Thank you, Ashley. Gucho, please.
Yeah. Let me start the answer by just focusing on some numbers. In 2020, there were 18 green bonds issued for a total of 67 billion Hong Kong dollars. 2021, 95 bonds for a total of 280. So from 67 to 280. And this year, which is obviously a tough year from a financial point of view, already over 400 billion issued in over 100 bonds. So just, I mean, the numbers are just like mind-boggling, and the growth in a really tough environment. I think the first part, we got it mostly as a result of the panel represented here. I mean, we're a great regulatory environment. Investors love investing in Hong Kong. We've seen what has been happening over the last few years, and how the market has been, really thriving despite all the headwinds. The government providing its support, represented by Joseph there. I mean, it's been very useful. And but the important thing is, this is just the beginning. What's more important is, what are the things that we're going to be doing from now on?
I cannot agree more. Yeah. So the total green and sustainable debt market is $1.7 trillion last year. And we need over 100 trillion in order to deliver the net zero. So massive funding gap, massive opportunity. Cannot agree more. So now let's come to the key for today's panels on, can you share with us what are the latest initiatives that will contribute to the next phase of growth for Hong Kong? For this one, I will start with Ashley, actually, to start with.
Okay, well, I'm going to broaden that out again, actually, because not least, I've been for the last 6 years chairing this organization called IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Regulators. So that's really the umbrella organization for market regulators as distinct from central banks, basically. And I just want to start there because, as I'll try to demonstrate, this is of direct relevance to Hong Kong. The IOSCO is extremely active in the whole area of climate finance, and in particular, the potential to turn what is basically a voluntary setup so far. Of course, Europe is moving to rules, and the US has proposed rules and such like, but basically that's what it is now. Shifting from a voluntary setup to elements of mandatory. Because if you're a regulator, you don't tend to supervise voluntary arrangements. This is not what we do. So that's why the work that we're doing collectively within IOSCO is important. Now, what we are hyper-focusing on at the moment are the exposure drafts that have been issued by the International Sustainability Standards Board, which, as many of you know, sits under the IFRS Foundation and is kind of the sister board to the board that's been in existence for 20 years, which oversees the production of IFRS accounting standards. So now, the reason we're hyper-focusing on that is that we have decided, number one, that if there is going to be a global baseline standard for real economy, corporate level climate disclosures, this is the right body to do it, not least because its governance setup is credible and is proven. that's the first thing. Second thing is that based on that, our aim is to set out the criteria, which we've done to an extent actually publicly, which we would pay attention to in order to, as an organization, endorse those standards once they're produced to our membership. And the idea is that that would then send a very strong signal to the membership around implementation. So far, so good, right? It's not straightforward. I was at COP26 about this time last year, last November, and that's when the establishment of the ISSB was announced. And I said at the time, it wasn't straightforward getting to the point in which it was announced, but the hard work starts now. And that's what's happening. It is quite difficult, and there are quite a lot of challenges. And in no particular order, the main ones so far are questions of interoperability of those standards with, say, European standards, US standards, and others. If the standards aren't interoperable, you end up with more competing standards, which would defeat the whole purpose of globally consistent and comparable disclosures and corporate reporting. And that question of interoperability is a big discussion, and it hasn't been nailed yet, but it needs to be. The second thing I'd point to is once you get past that, implementation. What we've heard, and this comes down back to Hong Kong, in our interactions around the potential to embed ISSB standards in Hong Kong through the listing rules, but potentially through other mechanisms as well, including potentially legislation down the track. What we have heard when we've been looking at, okay, what are the practical impediments to implementation of these standards as you can see them in the exposure drafts, is two words really. One is data availability, or lack of data, and access to data. And the other is capability or capacity of businesses of different sizes to take the standards on board and implement them. So that implies, and this conversation is now pretty active, that the ISSB standards can only really work well if there is also, as the standards are issued, sufficiently convincing implementation guidance around how you would phase the standards over time, possibly for different sectors and different countries. So the comments we've again encountered in this part of the world, and of course this does include mainland China, is developing markets have different capabilities and different environments when compared to developed markets around this, and in particular Europe. And the second point I've just, which is the question which is associated with that, which is data availability. So scaling and phasing is important. We're also looking at what is the relevance to these disclosures potentially to the hard numbers in financial statements. Because my personal view is that there's always a danger of spending a lot of time on disclosures in a sustainability report, which sits in one part of a company's report, whether it's in the annual report or wherever it might be. Then you have the hard numbers. And you remember rather famously, not very long ago, an HSBC asset manager made a speech. I think he was called Stuart Kirk, if I remember. And despite all the hyperbole around that, he actually made a point. His point was, from my perspective, it's not a financial risk. And the perspective he was talking about was the short-term financing decisions that banks actually make. That was his point. I'm not saying if it was right or wrong, but that was the point. So, but it kind of illustrated this question of the degree to which sustainability disclosures, in this context climate disclosures, actually have a relationship with the hard numbers in the accounts, which are largely historic? And if so, which parts of sustainability disclosures might have that impact? And I say that partly because the ISSB standards are based around a very important concept, which is disclosures or reporting of relevance to enterprise value, and therefore of relevance to investors. So it's just a point. And then the final thing I'd say is the development of assurance standards. Just as accounts, you naturally assume accounts are audited, they have to be audited, then the question for sustainability disclosures, in particular climate disclosures, is how are they going to be assured, recognizing that activity is going to be very different because there'll be a series of forward-looking disclosures, largely unlike conventional accounts, and also the information that you'll be looking at to provide assurance at whatever level you're providing it will often sit outside the company. And there's quite a big discussion at the moment around Scope 3 emissions data, much of which sits outside the company, which is required to report. So that's the nature of the discussion internationally. But your question is, what does it mean for Hong Kong? Well, number one, I think we are kind of determined to be an early adopter, partly going back to the remarks I made at the beginning about Hong Kong being a fulcrum for the mobilization of very large amounts of capital in a high emissions region. So that's the first thing. The question is then, how are we going to do that? Well, we're working closely with the exchange in relation to the listing rule aspects. We're working closely with the CSRC, our counterparts in Beijing, on this whole question of aligning expectations between the two systems in relation to mainland corporates. We're working with the Hong Kong ICPA and the Financial Reporting Council on this question of broader implementation, because after all, accounting standards sit within the rule book of the HICPA for accountants and auditors. And we're also looking at to them also to think further around this question of independent assurance of sustainability disclosures. And at the same time, we're looking at enhancing our expectations of asset managers at a financial institutions level. The question of product labeling, we've already done some work around this, and we've issued rules around this, but we're looking at how that might be enhanced. But my view is that is intimately linked with better quality and more extensive, relevant corporate level disclosure under the ISSB standards, because the reality is that the financial industry is unable to do a great deal unless it's got good real economy level data to work with and reporting around that. And the final thing I'd say is that I sometimes miss this out because it's kind of blindingly obvious. We are really, really focused on greenwashing. My view is greenwashing risks are real, and if all of these projects in which we're working both locally and internationally, if we don't get it right, then greenwashing does have the potential to undermine the effort altogether. It's really quite serious in my view. But I don't want to end on a sort of downbeat note. I think actually in Hong Kong collectively, whether it's the government, the exchange, ourselves, the HKMA, through our cross-agency steering group, we pulled together everyone around that. I think actually we're one of the places with the highest ambition in the world, but also with good focus. We have decided, at least I think we have, that we are focusing on climate first, and we need to get that right. If you dilute your efforts or around the S and the G, whatever the G means in this context, in the ESG landscape, then you do, I think, jeopardize your ability to get it right on the climate aspect. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ashley. I cannot agree more. The real work starts now when we're looking at implementation and the challenges around it. So can I come back to you, Gucho, as a regulator, as an operator, and a public company? Can I come to you?
Yes. There's a lot of areas that we are obviously working on, and the disclosure one that Ashley was talking about, I mean, it's a very important one, requires a lot of coordination, and there's a lot being done, but there's a lot also that we need to rely on global organizations, because we don't want to be like creating just like our own thing. We want to be plugged into the global infrastructure. Then, aside from that, there's an area around transparency and data, and we have we built something that's called Stage, where essentially we try to present the key products available to investors and key disclosures relating to companies in our markets. There's today 109 products that are listed in that platform. So that goes to the more to the points of providing transparency and data accessibility. It's still in the very early days, but I would say that the most important part where we can play a role coordinating with with SFC, with the government, international organizations, etc., is around creating the infrastructure for some of these carbon credits, let's say, to trade, a marketplace. And we've recently announced the setup, that was in July of this year, of the Hong Kong International Carbon Markets Council, of which your firm is a part of. And we have a lot of international firms. We have a lot of Chinese firms. We have potential issuers of carbon credits in there, potential buyers of carbon credits in there as well. And the objective is to get a cross-section of participants, stakeholders, making sure that we understand what they need, what their interests are, and build an infrastructure that is really geared towards being a first-class platform. And we're getting very close. I think that we're making a lot of progress. And in the not so distant future, I would expect to start seeing carbon being traded in our markets, and that's a great contributor to giving even more impetus to all this sustainability agenda in our region.
Thank you. So watch this space, and the next panel is on carbon markets, so do stay for the carbon market panel. So can I come back to you, Joseph?
Sure. Well, Ashley and Gucho mentioned about data, standards, and disclosure. Maybe I touch on another very key element to the success of sustainable finance is talents. At the end of the day, the financial industry is a people's industry. It's a people's business, same as green and sustainable finance. And in fact, if we look at this area, let's say 3, 5, 8 years ago, which much smaller scale, is grown so quickly. So it's difficult to find someone who have 5 or 10 years experience in that. So that means we need to work on training. And in that sense, in Hong Kong at the moment, a few universities are already offering like ESG or impact investing courses in the tertiary education level. And also certain industry bodies are offering training for practitioners. And from the government level, we plan to launch a 3-year pilot green and sustainable finance capacity support scheme, building support scheme, in the 4th quarter this year. So the scheme will provide subsidies to market practitioners, as well as prospective practitioners in the respective area to take up training and capacity building opportunities with regard to green and sustainable finance. And in addition to nurturing the talents on the practitioners level, on the students level, we also want to attract more non-local talents to come to Hong Kong. So that's why last year we have added professionals in ESG onto the talent list last year, with a view to attracting more talents in respect of those who are at the moment living outside Hong Kong to come to Hong Kong. And those eligible applicants who meet the requirements of that talent list can enjoy immigration facilitation under the Quality Migrant Admission Scheme after assessment. So you can see that at different levels, we're pushing hard to ensure we have enough supply of ESG talents to fuel the growth of this business.
Thank you, Joseph. Cannot agree more. ESG talents is like hot market right now, and with the funding gap that we need to fulfill to address the climate issue, I think that is only can scale up, and the program subsidies is definitely appreciated. With that, it comes to my last question of the sessions. So we have seen green and sustainable finance centers being developed in many centers in speed. So what is your need in Hong Kong to secure us as the regional, international, green and sustainable finance center? From each of you, this one I start with Gucho.
Okay. So what differentiates us? I think that I have to say that the first thing is where we are. Okay, we're the most international city of China, the most Chinese city outside of the mainland. China is 30% of the carbon emissions around the world, roughly, and there's so much need to help in that transition. So being located where we are, it's just like an incredible advantage and privilege. And so I would say that the first one is being the super connector between China and the world is a very, very unique proposition, a very unique advantage. The second one that I would say is being having this vibrant market that we've created over the years, whereby we have investors from all over the world, participants from all over the world that come to Hong Kong to connect capital with opportunities, that try to find a way to see how they can deploy their capital. And so that is an incredible opportunity as well. I mean, almost every significant bank is represented in Hong Kong, has a presence in Hong Kong, and almost every significant fund globally also has a presence. It's big in private equity, hedge funds, etc. So being in that privileged position of having access to that capital flow, that rule-based system that has been established over many, many decades, consistent regulation, that is very, very important. And finally, I'll mention the linkage between what's going to happen in the future and today. We call it like the connecting today with tomorrow. When we think about GBA and the fact that GBA includes so much focus around technology, new economy, the future, this is like having Silicon Valley right next to Wall Street. I mean, you have like these centers, and when you think about GBA and the impact that it can have, like over 80 million people. I mean, such a significant potential with everyone thinking about like the next thing, technology, all those innovations. They contribute to making a new environment, and so when you tie all those three things, there's almost no center around the world that can do what we can do. So I'm very optimistic. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done. We can't just like say, okay, it's all good, we have all these conditions, it's going to be great. There's a lot to be done, but I do see a lot of coordination with everyone around Hong Kong trying to get to this medium-term objective of being the sustainability capital of the world.
Thank you, Gucho. Ashley.
Right, okay, so I think I agree with Gucho on the first point. I mean, it's, as in other respects, our function as a bridge for global capital flows to and from mainland China is absolutely fundamental. And as I mentioned earlier on, China accounts for around 30% of global emissions, so it's quite clear that it is within Asia, it has the greatest need for climate finance to achieve net zero goals. So that's fairly obvious, and we have a unique position in relation to intermediation of capital. The second one, of course I'd say this, is high regulatory standards. So as CEO of the SFC, that goes without saying. Third one, I think this is actually quite important. We are globally very influential in this area. And success for certainly the project which we're looking at most urgently, which is standards around climate reporting for corporates, that depends on global alignment for the reasons I mentioned earlier on. It utterly depends on sufficient global alignment. So my view is like this. This is not about a competition to see who's going to be the world's largest green hub. Because if you do that, or go down that path, you will not succeed. I think actually for each center that is a financial center, whether it's Brussels so far as Europe is concerned, or mainland Europe is concerned, whether it's New York, whether it's Singapore, or whether it's Hong Kong, they all have a different role to play in reality. And they do need to coordinate, because after all, we are dealing with a global emergency, and that requires coordination. Now, of course, I hope that what seem to be increasing in severity global or geopolitical tensions don't get in the way of this. But there is that concern at the moment, which I think is a real concern, but obviously everyone in the field is trying to make sure that that does not get in the way of what we're doing. And I just come back to this question of globally influential. Of course, Dr. Marjan in here has multiple roles on the international stage in groups, and in particular around the sort of G20 nexus, but not only that, in order to look at everything from taxonomies to disclosures to partnerships between China and the UK and similar. So that demonstrates the global reach we have. And in all my interactions within these groups, it is obvious to me that Dr. Ma's sort of reputation precedes him. So, you know, we are influential, and so we, broadly, the community in this part of the world. Secondly, other examples, our deputy CEO in the SFC co-chairs the work stream that is basically in charge of thinking around endorsing, or how we endorse the ISSB standards down the track. That is not our only interaction with that. We also interact within the Financial Stability Board very, very actively on the way they are looking at the whole question of climate from a financial stability perspective, how they've constructed their roadmap, which they've announced. So again, an influential position. At the same time, Ravi Menon, who is the head of the MAS in Singapore, he chairs now something called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is basically the collective effort around central bankers, around risks on bank balance sheets and associated work around that. Again, very, very important, and I'm really glad, actually, that there is an Asia chair around that, because Asia is so important to this effort, for the reason I explained. So I think really sort of the message is Hong Kong has, you know, a natural seat at the table because of its positioning. Number one, that's the point that Gucho made. Number two, let's not get into who's the largest hub and all that sort of competitive sort of narrative around this, because we will succeed if we collaborate. And then finally, we do have an influential voice, and we should have one, because you can only solve the climate crisis if you solve it in Asia.
Wow. Joseph, I don't envy you after Gucho and Ashley. A lot of good points being covered, but please.
Well, actually, that makes my job even easier. But I definitely agree with what Gucho and Ashley said in that aspect, and I can try to share from another angle. If you ask me one thing unique about our strengths or so, I would say it's one country, two system. Because under one country, two system, again, we are the gateway between the mainland and the international markets. So as our country achieve the 30/60 target, we have a huge role to play and tremendous opportunities. For example, over the last few years, the majority of green bonds issued by mainland issuers were actually issued onshore. So growingly, definitely, they would like to tap into the international pool of money, and Hong Kong will have a lot of opportunities in that area. And of course, again, riding on one country, two system, with basic law, we have free flow of capital, free flow of information, We have our independent judiciary, simple and low tax system, so on and so forth, as our core competitiveness. These sound very simple and we kind of take it for granted. But if you look at certain crucial juncture in history, be that Asian financial crisis, September 11, or 2008 financial tsunami, many other cities or economies in Asia, they would impose certain restriction or capital control. But Hong Kong always stand firm with our linked exchange rate system. We stand firm with free flow of capital, and that gives investors confidence. And I think that's what contributed to Hong Kong being a leading international financial center today here. And in the future, as we develop green and sustainable finance, this will continue to be crucial. I appreciate that time is of essence. Last point I would like to make is, riding on what Gucho mentioned, I think we are already building on a position of strength. As Tracy mentioned earlier on, last year, the green and sustainable bond issued or arranged in Hong Kong reached close to $57 billion, which is 4 times of the previous years. And in fact, in addition to green bonds or so, if you look at the first Asia green bond ETF in Asia was listed in Hong Kong. If you look at the first Asia's retail certificate of deposit was issued in Hong Kong as well. If you look at the first offshore Asia ETF was listed in Hong Kong as well. The first Greater Bay Area themed green bond was issued in Hong Kong as well. So we see that not only we are leading in terms of market share, but also in terms of innovation, in terms of leading on launching new products, we have always been doing that. So I think with that strong base, we can continue to do a lot more, and the government and regulators will continue to make sure this will happen.
Thank you. Gucho, Ashley, Joseph, thank you very much for a candid sharing. And after listening to you, Hong Kong being the super connector, access to capital, high standard of regulation, and the focus and willingness to collaborate amongst different international centers, I am confident, and I hope all of you on the floor are confident that we are ready for Hong Kong Green and Sustainable Finance Hub 2.0. So with that, please join me for a round of applause to thank our speaker for the sharing today. Please remain seated for a group picture. Have a group picture, please. Thanks.